Hello, guys. Welcome to Psych Minds. We are reading Demian by Hermann Hesse. If you have not subscribed yet, do subscribe, like, and share. We are on chapter 5 of the book. The bird fights its way out of the egg. My painted dream bird was on its way, searching out my friend. An answer came to me in the most curious manner. In my classroom in school, I found at my desk in the interval between two lessons a piece of paper slipped between the pages of my book. It was folded in the manner we used for passing notes to one another in class. I wondered who could have sent me such a note, as I was not so intimate with any of the boys that one of them should wish to write to me. I thought it was a summon to practice in some school rag or other, in which, however, I should not have taken part, and I replaced the note unopened in my book. During the lesson, it fell by chance into my hands again. It fell. I toyed with the paper, unfolded it without thinking, and discovered a few words written thereon. I threw a glance at the writing. One word riveted my attention. Terrified, I read on, while my heart seemed to become numb with a sense of destiny. The bird fights its way out of the egg. The egg is the world. Whoever will be born must destroy a world. The bird flies to God. The name of the God is Abraxas. I sank into deep meditation after I had read the words through several times. It admitted of no doubt this was Demian's answer. None could know of the bird except our two selves. He had received my picture. He had understood and helped me to explain its significance. But where was the connection in all this? And what worried me above all, what did Abraxas mean? I had never read or heard of the word. The name of the god is Abraxas. The hour passed without my hearing anything of the lesson. The next lesson began, the last of the morning. It was taken by quite a young assistant master, fresh from the university, to whom we had already taken a liking, because he was young and pretended to know false dignity with us. We were reading Herodotus under Dr. Follen's guidance. This was one of the few school subjects which interested me, but this time my attention wandered. I had mechanically flung open my book, but I did not follow the translation and remained lost in thought. For the rest, I had already several times had the experience that what Demian had said to me in the confirmation class was right. If you willed a thing strongly enough, it happened. If during the lesson I was deeply immersed in thought, I need not fear that the master would disturb my peace. Certainly, if you were absent minded or sleepy, then he stood suddenly there. That had already happened to me several times. But if you were really thinking, if you were genuinely sunk in thought, then you were safe. And I had already put to the test what he had said to me about fixing a person with one's eyes. When at school with Demian, I had never been successful in this attempt, but now I often realize that you could accomplish much simply by a fixed look and deep thinking. So I was sitting now, my thoughts far from Herodotus and school, but the master's voice unexpectedly fell on my consciousness like a thunder crash, so that I started with fright. I listened to his voice. He was standing quite close to me. I thought he had already called me by name, but he did not look at me. I breathed a sigh of relief. Then I heard his voice again. Loudly, the word Abraxas fell from his lips. Continuing his explanation, the beginning of which had escaped me, Dr. Follen said, "We must not imagine the ideas of those sects and mystical corporations of antiquity to be as naive as they appear from the standpoint of a rationalistic outlook. Antiquity knew absolutely nothing of science, in our sense of the word. On the other hand, more attention was paid to truths of a philosophical, mystical nature, which often attain to a very high stage of development. Magic in part arose therefrom, and often led to fraud and crime. But nonetheless, magic had a noble origin and was inspired by deep thought. So it was with the teaching of Abraxas, which I have just cited as an example. This name is used in connection with Greek charm formulas. Many opinion coincide in thinking it is the name of some demon of magic, such as some savage people worship today. But it appears that Abraxas had a much wider significance. We can imagine the name to be that of a divinity on whom the symbolical task was imposed of uniting the divine and the diabolical. I learned little. Learned little man continued his discourse with much seriousness. No one was very attentive, and as the name did not recur, I was soon immersed in my own thoughts again. To unite the divine and the diabolical rang in my ears. Here was a standpoint. I was familiar with that idea from my conversation with Demian in the very last period of our friendship. Demian told me then we had indeed a God whom we revered, but this God represented part of the world only, the half which was arbitrarily separated from the rest. It was the official permitted bright world, but one should be able to hold the whole world in honor. One should either have a god who was at the same time a devil, or one should institute devil worship there together with worship of God. And now Abraxas was the god who was at the same time God and devil. For a long time, I zealously sought to follow up the trail of ideas farther without success. In addition, I rummaged through a whole library to find out more about Abraxas, but in vain. However, it was not my nature to concentrate my energies on a methodical search after knowledge, a search which would reveal truths of a dead, useless documentary kind. The figure of Beatrice, which had for a certain time occupied so much of my attention, vanished by degrees from my mind, or rather receded slowly, drawing nearer and nearer to the horizon, becoming paler, more like a shadow as it retreated. She satisfied my soul to no longer. A new spiritual development now began to take place in the dreamy existence I led. This existence in which I was strangely wrapped up in myself. The longing for a full life glowed in me, or rather the longing for love. The sex instinct, which for a time had been merged into my worship of Beatrice, required new pictures and aims. Fulfillment was denied me, and it was more impossible than ever for me to delude myself by expecting anything of the girls who seemed to have the happiness of my comrades in their keeping. I again dreamed vividly, even more by day than by night. Images presented themselves to me, desires in the shape of pictures rose up in my imagination, withdrawing me from the outside world, so that my relations with these pictures, with these dreams and shadows, were more real and more intimate than with my actual surroundings. A certain dream or play of fantasy which returned to me was full of significance. This dream, the most important and the most enduring of my life, was as follows. I returned home. Over the front door shone the crest with the yellow bird on the blue ground. My mother came to meet me, but as I entered and wished to embrace her, it was not she, but a shape I had never before seen, tall and powerful, resembling Max Damian and my painting, yet different and quite womanly in spite of its size. This figure drew me towards it and held me in a quivering, passionate embrace. Rapture and horror were mixed. The embrace was a sort of divine worship and yet a crime as well. Too much of the memory of my mother, too much of the memory of Max Demian was contained in the form which embraced me. The embrace seemed repulsive to my sentiment of reverence, yet I felt happy. I often awoke out of this dream with a deep feeling of contentment, often with the fear of death and a tormenting conscience as if I were guilty of a terrible sin. It was only gradually and unconsciously that I realized the connection between this mental picture and the hint which had come to me from outside concerning the God of whom I was in search. However, this connection became closer and more intimate, and I began to feel that precisely in this dream, this presentiment, I was invoking Abraxas. Rapture and horror, man and woman, the most sacred things and the most abominable interwoven, the darkest guilt with the most tender innocence. Such was the dream picture of my love. Such also was Abraxas. Love was no longer a dark animal impulse as I had felt with considerable anxiety in the beginning. Neither was it a pious spiritual form of worship any longer, such as I had bestowed upon this picture of Beatrice. It was both and yet much more. It was the image of an angel and of Satan, man and woman in one, human being and animal, the highest good and lowest evil. It was my destiny. It seemed that I should experience this in my own life. I longed for it and was afraid of it. I followed it in my dreams and took to flight before it, but it was always there, was always standing over me. The next spring, I was to leave school and go to some university to study, where and what I knew not. A small moustache grew on my lip. I was a grown man, and yet completely hopeless and aimless. Only one thing was firm, the voice in me, the dream picture. I felt it my duty to follow this guidance blindly. But it was difficult, and daily I was on the point of revolting. Perhaps I was mad. I often used to think perhaps I was not as other men. But I could do everything the others did. With a little pains and industry, I could read Plato. I could solve a trigonometrical problem or work out a chemical analysis. Only one thing I could not do, discover the dark, concealed aim within me and make up my mind. As others did, others knew well enough whether they wanted to be a professor or judges, doctors or artists. They knew what careers to follow and what advantages they would gain by it. But I was not like that. Perhaps I would be like them someday, but how was I to know? Perhaps I should have to seek and seek for years and would make nothing of myself, would attain no end. Perhaps I should attain an end, but it might be wicked, dangerous, terrible. I wanted only to try to live in obedience to the prompting which came from my true self. Why was that so very difficult? I often made the attempt to paint the powerful love figure of my dream, but I never succeeded. If I had been successful, I would have sent the picture to Demian. Where was he? I knew not. I only knew there was a bond of union between us. When should I see him again? The pleasant tranquility of those weeks and months of the Beatrice period was long since gone. I thought at that time I had reached a haven and had found peace, but it was ever so. Scarcely did I begin to adapt myself to circumstances, scarcely had a dream done me good, when it faded again, in vain to complain. I now lived in fire of unstilled desires, of tense expectations, which often rendered me completely wild and mad. I frequently saw before me the picture of my dream mistress with extraordinary clearness, much more clearly than I saw my own hand. I spoke to it, wept over it, cursed it. I called it mother and knelt before it in tears. I called it my beloved and felt its ripe kiss of fulfilled desire. I called it devil and whore and vampire and murderer. It invited me to the tenderest dreams of love and to the most horrible abominations. Nothing was too good and precious for it, nothing too bad and vile. I passed the whole of that winter in a state of inward tumult difficult to describe. I had long been accustomed to loneliness that did not depress me. I lived with Damian, with the hawk, with my picture of the big dream figure, which was my fate and my mistress. It sufficed to live in close communion with those things, since they opened up a large and broad perspective leading to Abraxas, but I was not able to summon up these dreams, these thoughts at will. I could not invest them in colors as I pleased. They came of themselves, taking possession of me, governing me, and shaping my life. I was secure in so far as the outside world was concerned. I was afraid of no one. My schoolfellows had learned to recognize that and observed a secret respect towards me, which often caused me to smile. When I wished I could penetrate most of them with a look, thereby surprising them occasionally, only I seldom or never wanted to do this. It was my own self which occupied my attention, always myself, and yet I longed ardently to live a bit of real life, to give something of myself to the world, to enter into contact and battle with it. Sometimes, as I wandered through the stress in the evening and could not, through restlessness, return home before midnight, I thought to myself, now I cannot fail to meet my beloved. I shall overtake her at the next corner. She will call to me from the next window. Sometimes all this seemed to torture me unbearably, and I was quite prepared to take my own life some day. At that time, I found a peculiar refuge, by chance, as one says. But really, such happenings cannot be attributed to chance. When a person is in need of something and the necessary happens, this is not due to chance but to himself. His own desire leads him compellingly to the object of which he stands in need. 2 or 3 minutes during my wandering through the streets, I had heard the strains of an organ coming from a little church in the suburbs, without, however, stopping to listen. The next time I passed by the church, I heard it again and recognized that Bach was being played. I went to the door, which I found to be locked. As the street was practically empty, I sat down on the curbed stone close to the church, turned up the collar of my coat, and listened. It was not a large organ, but a good one, nevertheless. Whoever was playing played wonderfully well, almost like a virtuoso, but with a peculiar highly personal expression of will and perseverance, which seemed to make the music ring out like a prayer. I had the feeling that the man who was playing knew a treasure was shut up in the music, and he struggled and tapped and knocked to get at the treasure, as if his life depended on his finding it. In the technical sense, I do not understand very much about music, but this form of the soul's expression I have from my childhood intuitively understood. I feel music is something which I can comprehend without initiation. The organist next played something modern. It might have been Reger. The church was almost completely dark, only a very narrow beam of light shone through the window nearest to me. I waited until the end and then walked up and down till the organist came out. He was still a young man, though older than myself, robust and thick set. He walked quickly, taking powerful strides, but as if forcing the pace against his will. Many an evening thereafter, I sat before the church or walked up and down. Once I found the door open, and for half an hour I sat shivering and happy inside, while the organist played in the organ loft by the dim gaslight. Of the music he played, I heard not only what he himself put into it, there seemed also to be a secret coherence in his repertory. Each piece seemed to be the continuation of the one preceding. Everything he played was pious, expressing faith and devotion, but not pious like churchgoers and clergymen, but like pilgrims and beggars of the Middle Ages, pious with a reckless surrender to the world feelings, which was superior to all confessions of faith. He frequently played music by the pre-Bach composers and old Italian music, and all the pieces he said the same thing. All expressed what the musician had in his soul, longing, a longing to identify oneself with the world and to tear oneself free again, listening to the workings of one's own dark soul, an orgy of devotion and lively curiosity of the wonderful. I once secretly followed the organist as he left the church. He continued his way to the outskirts of the town and entered a little tavern. I could not resist the temptation to go in after him, but for the first time I had a clear view of him. He sat at the table in the corner of the little room, a black felt hat on his head, a measure of wine before him, and his face was just as I had expressed it to be. It was ugly and somewhat uncouth, with the look of a seeker and of an eccentric, obstinate and strong willed, with a soft and childish mouth. The expression of what was strong and manly lay in the eyes and forehead. On the lower half of the face sat a look of gentleness and immaturity, rather effeminate and showing a lack of self mastery. The chin indicated a boyish indecision, as if in contradiction with the eyes and forehead. I liked the dark brown eyes, full of pride and hostility. Silently, I took my place opposite him. There was no one else in the tavern. He glared at me as if he wished to chase me away. Nevertheless, I maintained my position, looking at him unflinchingly, until at last he growled testily, "What the deuce are you staring at me for? Do you want anything from me?" "I don't want anything," I said. "You have already given me much." He wrinkled his forehead. "Ah, you are a music enthusiast, are you? I think it's disgusting to go mad over music." I did not let myself be intimidated. "I have so often listened to your playing there in the church," I said, "but I don't want to bother you. I thought perhaps I should discover something in you, something special. I don't know exactly what, but please don't mind me. I can listen to you in the church." "Why, I always lock the door." "Just lately you forgot, and I sat inside. Otherwise, I stand outside or sit on the curbstone." "Is that so? Another time you can come inside. It's warmer. You have simply got to knock on the door, but loudly, not while I'm playing. Now, what did you want to say? But you are quite young, apparently a schoolboy or a student. Are you a musician?" "No, I like music, but only the kind you play. Absolute music, where one feels that someone is trying to fathom heaven and hell. I like music so much, I think, because it is not concerned with morals. Everything else is a question of morals, and I am looking for something different. Whatever has been concerned with morals has caused me only suffering. I don't express myself properly. Do you know that there must be a God who is at the same time God and devil? There must have been one. I have heard so. The organist pushed back his broad hat and shook the dark hair from his forehead. He looked at me penetratingly and bent forward his face forwards towards me over the table. Softly and tensely he questioned, "What's the name of the God of whom you are talking?" Unfortunately, I know practically nothing about him really. Only his name. His name is Abraxas. The musician looked distrustfully around as if someone might be eavesdropping. Then he bent towards me and said in a whisper, "I thought so. Who are you?" "I'm a student from the school." "How do you know about Abraxas?" "By chance." He thumped on the table so that his wine spilled over. "Chance? Don't talk nonsense, young man. One doesn't know of Abraxas by chance. Mark you. I will tell you something more of him. I know a little about him." He ceased talking and pushed back his chair. I looked at him expectantly and he made a grimace. "Not here. Another time. There, take these." He dug his hand into the pocket of his overcoat, which he had not taken off, and pulled out a couple of roasted chestnut, which he threw to me. I said nothing. I took and ate them and was very contented. "Well," he whispered after a while, "how do you know about him?" I did not hesitate to tell him. "I was lonely and perplexed," I related. "I called to mind a friend of former years who I think knows a great deal. I had painted something, a bird coming out of a terrestrial globe. I sent this to him. After a time, when I had begun to lose hope of a reply, a piece of paper fell into my hands, or it was on it was written, 'The bird fights its way out of the egg. The egg is the world. Whoever will be born must destroy a world. The bird flies to God. The name of the god is Abraxas.'" He answered nothing. We peeled our chestnut and ate them and drank our wine. "Shall we have another drink?" he asked. "Thanks. No, I don't care much for drinking." He laughed, somewhat disappointedly. "As you wish. I am different. I'm staying here. You can go." The next time I saw him after the organ recital, he was not very communicative. He conducted me through an old street to an old stately house and upstairs into a large, somewhat gloomy and untidy room where, besides a piano, there was nothing to indicate that its occupant was a musician. Instead, a huge bookcase and writing table gave the room a somewhat scholarly air. "What a lot of books you have," I said appreciatively. "A part of them belongs to me, to the library of my father." "With whom I live?" "Yes, young man, I live with my father and mother, but I cannot introduce you to them, as I and my acquaintances meet with but scant respect at home. I'm a prodigal son, you see. My father is very much looked up to. He is a well known clergyman and preacher in this town, and I, to let you know at once, am his talented and promising son, who, however, is guilty of many backslidings and, to a certain extent, mad. I was studying theology and deserted this worthy faculty shortly before my final examination, although really I am still in the same line as far as concerns my private studies. For me, it is still of the highest importance and interest what sort of gods people have invented for themselves at various times. I am a musician into the bargain and shall soon get a post as organist, I think. Then I shall be in the church again. I glanced over the backs of the books and found Greek, Latin, Hebrew titles as far as I could see by the feeble light of the lamp on the table. My acquaintance, meanwhile, had taken up a position on the floor in the dark by the wall. "Come here," he called after a while. "We will practice a little philosophy. That means keeping one's mouth shut, lying on one's stomach and thinking." He struck a match and applied it to the paper and wood in the fireplace, in front of which he was lying. The flame leapt up. He poked and blew the fire with great skill. I lay down near him on the ragged carpet. He stared into the flames, which drew my attention as well, and we lay silent for perhaps a whole hour stretched out in front of the flaring wood fire. We watched it flame and roar, die down and flicker up again until finally it settled down into a subdued glow. "Fire worship was not by any means the silliest form of worship invented," he murmured, without looking up. Those were the only words spoken. With staring eyes, I gazed into the fire, lulled by the tranquillity of the room. I sank in dreams, seeing shapes in the smoke and pictures in the ashes. Once I started up, my companion had thrown a little bit of raisins into the glow. A little slender flame shot up. I saw in it the bird with the god hawk's head. In the glow which died away in the fireplace, golden glittering threads wove themselves together into a net. Letters and pictures, memories of faces, of animals, of plants, of worms and serpents. When I woke from my reveries and looked across at my companion, he was absorbed, staring at the ashes with the fixed gaze of a fanatic, his chin in his hand. I must go now, I said softly. Well, go then. Goodbye. He did not get up, and as the lamp had gone out, I had to feel my way across the dark room, through dark corridors and down the stairs, and so out of the enchanted old dwelling. Once in the street, I stopped and looked up at the house. In not one of the windows was a light burning. A little brass plate shone in the gleam of the gas lamp before the door. Pistorius Vicar, I read thereon. As I sat in my little room after supper, I remembered that I had learned nothing about Abraxas or anything else from Pistorius. We had scarcely exchanged the 10 words, but I was quite contented with the visit I had paid him, and he had promised to play next time an exquisite piece of organ music, a Passacaglia by Buxtehude. Without my having realized it, the organist Pistorius had given me the first lesson. As we lay on the floor in front of the fireplace of his melancholy hermit's room, staring into the fire had done me good. It had confirmed and set in activity tendencies which I had always had, but had never really followed. Gradually and in part I saw light on the subject. When quite a child, I had, from time to time, the propensity to watch bizarre forms of nature, not observing them closely, but simply surrendering myself to their peculiar magic, absorbed by the contemplation of their curling shapes, long dignified tree roots, colored veins in stones, flecks of oil floating on water, floors in glass. All things of a similar nature had had great charm for me at that time. Above all, water and fire. Smoke, clouds, dust, and especially the little circulating color specks which I saw when I closed my eyes. In the days followed my first visit to Pistorius, this began to come back to me. I noticed that I was indebted solely to staring into the open fire for a certain strength and pleasure, for the increase in my depth of feeling which I had felt since. It was curiously beneficial and enriching, dreaming and staring into the fire. To the few experiences I had gained on the road to the attainment of my proper ends in life was added this new one. The contemplation of such shapes, the surrendering of oneself to these irrational, twisting, odd forms of nature, engenders in us a feeling of harmony of our inner being with the will which brought forth these shapes. We soon felt the temptation to look upon them as our own creations, as if made by our own moods. We see the boundary between ourselves and nature waver and vanish. We learn to know the state of mind by outside impressions or by inward. In no way so simple and so easily as by this practice do we discover to what a great extent we are creators, to what a great extent our souls have part in the continual creation of the world. Or rather, it is the same invisible Godhead, indivisible Godhead which is active in us and in nature. If the outside world fell in ruins, one of us would be capable of building it up again. For mountain and stream, tree and leaf, root and blossom, all that is shaped by nature lies modeled in us, comes from the soul, whose essence is eternity, of whose essence we are ignorant, but which is revealed to us for the most part as love force and creative power. Many years later, I found this observation confirmed in a book. One of the Leonardo da Vinci's, who in one passage remarks how good and deeply moving it is to look at a wall on which many people have spat. He felt the same sensation before those spots on the wet wall as Pistorius and I before the fire. At our next meeting, the organist enlightened me still further on the subject. We confine our personality within much too narrow bounds. We count as composing our person only that which distinguishes us as individuals, only that which we recognize as irregular. But we are made up from the entire world stock. each one of us, and just as in our bodies displayed the genealogical table of development back to the fish stage and still further. So we have accumulated in our soul all the experiences through which a human soul has ever lived. All the gods and devils which have ever been, whether those of the Greeks or Chinese or Zulus, all are in us, are there in potentialities as desires, as starting points. If all mankind died out, with the exception of a single moderately gifted child who had not enjoyed the slightest instructions, so would this child rediscover the whole process of things. It would be able to produce gods, demons, paradises, the commandments and prohibition, Old and New Testaments, everything. Well and good, I objected. But then what does the worth of the individual consist of? Why do we continue to strive if everything has already been achieved in us? Stop, exclaimed Pistorius vehemently. There is a great difference between whether one merely carries the world in oneself or whether one is conscious of that as well. A madman can have ideas which remind one of Plato, and a pious little boy in a Moravian boarding school will recreate in his thoughts profound mythological ideas which occur in the Gnostics or in the Zoroaster. But he does not realize it. He is a tree or a stone, at best an animal, as long as he does not know it. But when the first spark of this knowledge glimmers in him, he becomes a man. You will not consider all the two-legged creatures who walk out there in the street as human beings, simply because they walk erect and carry their young 9 months in the womb. Look how many of them are fish or sheep, worms or leeches. How many are ants or bees? Well, in reach of them are the possibilities of becoming human creature, but not only when they feel this. It is only when, if even in part, they learn to make them conscious that these potentialities become theirs. Our conversations were somewhat after this style. They seldom taught me anything completely new, anything absolutely surprising, but all, even the most banal, hit like a light, persistent hammer stroke on the same point in me. All helped in my development, all helped to peel off skins, to break up eggshells, and after each talk, I held my head somewhat higher. I was more sure of myself until my yellow bird pushed his beautiful bird of prey crest through the ruins of the world shell. We frequently related our dreams to one another. Pistorius knew how to interpret them. A curious example comes to my mind. I dreamed I was able to fly. I was flung through the air, so to speak, impelled by a great force over which I had not the mastery. The sensation of this flight was exhilarating, but soon changed to fear as I saw myself snatched up involuntarily to risky heights. There I made the saving discovery that I could control my rise and fall by arresting my breath and by breathing again. Pistorius interpreted it as follows. The swing which sent you up into the air is the great property of mankind, which everyone possesses. It is the feeling of close relationship with the springs of every force, but it soon causes anxiety. It is cursedly dangerous. For that reason, most people willingly renounce flying, preferring to walk according to prescribed law along with a footpath. But not you. You fly higher as befits an intelligent fellow. And behold, you make a wonderful discovery there, namely, you gradually get the mastery over the impelling force. In other words, you acquire a fine little force of your own, an instrument, a rudder. That is splendid. Without that, one goes floating into the air without any will of one's own. Madmen, for instance, do that. They have deeper presentiment than the most people on the footpath, but they have no key and no rudder. They fall whistling through the air down into the fathomless depth. But you, Sinclair, you manage all right. And how, pray? You probably don't even know. You manage with a new instrument, with a breath regulator. And now you can see that your soul isn't really personal at the bottom. I mean, that you didn't invent this regulator. It isn't new. It is alone. It has existed for thousands of years. It is the balancing organ fish have, the air bladder. Even today, we actually still have a few very rare kind of fish whose air bladder is at the same time a sort of lung, and on occasion can use it to breathe with. In your dream, you made use of your lungs in exactly the same way as these fish do their air bladder. He even brought me a volume on zoology and showed me the original drawings of these ancient fishes. And with a peculiar thrill, I felt an organ of early evolutionary epochs functioning in me. Interesting. That brings us to the end of chapter 5. Bye bye for now. If you have any comments, any question, any feedback, positive or negative, you can reach out to me in the comment section of the video you're viewing or in the community section of YouTube channel. And all the suggestions are welcome, recommendations of the books that you want me to read. Bye bye for now. Take care and keep reading.